All right, this is Lecture 3C, third part of Lecture 3 for History 111. I want to turn now to talking about the people who came after Harappan civilization, because I mentioned in the last part of the lecture that Harappan civilization began to decline about 2000 BC and had pretty much collapsed by 1500 BC. Well, just coincidentally, this corresponds to the arrival of a group of nomadic pastoralists who are often referred to as the Aryans, arriving in northern India about the same time. Now, it used to be this used to be called the Aryan invasion, and it was imagined that these people came sweeping out of Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia and conquered India. The reality is probably a whole lot different, because the Aryans were actually an Indo-European people. They probably originated in modern-day Ukraine, just north of the Caspian Sea or the Black Sea. And they were pastoralists. They had domesticated cattle and dogs and horses were the big one. They were good with horses. They had invented a wheel, so they had carts and chariots and things like that. But not the spoked wheel. That's a lighter, much better wheel, but they had solid wheels, just circles of wood, basically. But the Aryans also had bronze metallurgy, which was really superior to stone or anything that anybody else had before that. And so this group of Indo-Europeans, or Proto-Indo-Europeans they're sometimes called, it seems like that group originating in Ukraine and into Central Asia was part of several massive migrations over the course of history. They migrated into India in the so-called Aryan invasion, although it's not an invasion. They migrated into Iran and Persia, and in fact the word Iran is probably a corruption of Aryan. And they migrated into Europe, and we know this because of language. All the languages, not all the languages, but many of the languages of India, Persia, the Middle East, not the Semitic languages, I don't believe, but and most of the languages of Europe, German and Latin and Greek, etc. These languages are all related, right? You can find lots of words that are basically a very similar word in languages in India, in Persian, or in German or Latin languages. And linguists actually argue that this is because these Indo-Europeans from Ukraine, etc., developed this one language, and they spread. They were pastoralists. They moved a lot, right? And they had agriculture, but they moved a lot to tend animals. And so we know that there was a massive migration out of Central Asia and into India, which I'm going to talk about now. We know there was a migration into Iran, which I'll talk about in a later lecture. We know there were lots of migrations into Europe, and I'll talk about those in a later lecture. So these Indo-Europeans arrive, the so-called Aryans arrive. Just as a side note, you're all going, yeah, that's the same word that the Nazis used. And yes, the Nazis picked this up, and they thought that Aryan was a race. It's not. It's a culture. It's a language. And they spun it into this a real fantasy of the original European peoples, and as the root of the German race, etc. All that is, not to put too fine a point on it, bullshit. The reality is far different, and it really doesn't. The Nazis just spun this into a bizarre fantasy. So basically what really happens then is that these Indo-European peoples, the Aryans, start to migrate into the Indus River Valley, and then they migrate through that into India. And they're not coming as an invasion. They're not coming as a conquering army or anything like that. They're coming probably in small groups, tribes, and they're looking for land, and they're running into the Harappan civilization when it's declining. And I'll talk in a little bit. It's not clear whether the Aryans actually helped destroy Harappan civilization or whether Harappan civilization was declining, and that's why the Aryans were able to move in. It's not sure which is chicken and which is egg. And so the Aryans are moving in, and they're bringing these new technologies, bronze metallurgy, wheels, horses, etc. And this is giving them an advantage. And so they gradually move into India, and they wind up often coming into conflict with Dravidian peoples, but often they coexist peacefully with them. The Dravidian peoples were the people who already existed in India, and they probably looked different than the Aryans. The Aryans probably had lighter skin and lighter hair color, and the Dravidian peoples probably had darker skin and darker hair color. In any case, the culture that emerges in India over these hundreds of years BCE is a mixture of Aryan culture and Dravidian culture. Okay, and one of the things that really emerges out of this is a complex society, right? They have a complex society with all sorts of rules and culture and religion and cities and all of that. And we'll talk about this. We're going to return to India several times over the course. But one of the initial ideas that they organized this society around is an idea that this nice short word, Varnashrama Dharma. And the word is actually made up of three words. First is Varna, which originally meant color, and it probably meant the Dravidian versus Aryan. But as those peoples interacted, it stopped meaning color. And instead, Varna comes to mean caste, social caste, a really rigid class system. The second is ashrama, which is the idea of stages of life, right? That you owe respect to the elders, and that life has different stages and different roles that you take on at different stages in life. And the last is dharma, which means sort of the cosmic order of the world and your duty in that cosmic order of the world. And what this whole concept means then is that each person has a social caste, a class position. They have a position, an age, and a position in life. Are they married? Are they not married? Are they parents? Are they not parents? Are they old? Are they wealthy or not wealthy? And then they also have, because of that, because of their caste, and because there are rules for their social class, how they're supposed to act, and behavior in this society is really governed by this. Your social caste and your stage in life really gives you a role. It dictates this is how you should be acting right now, right? And so Varnashrama Dharma is really just a sort of a cultural framework for organizing society and telling people how they're supposed to act. It's the rules of society, right? And one of the key parts of this is this caste system. And a caste system is basically a class system, except that it's much more rigid. You can't move out of a caste system. You can't change castes very easily. And so you're born into a caste, and that identity, that caste identity, stays with you. Now, in Indian society, as it emerges out of this period, there are really four castes, although there's a fifth caste, which is not called a caste. So the first caste is called the Brahmins. And this is the priestly class, right? They are the priests who handle the religion. They do the ceremonies and the sacrifices and things like that. And they are considered the most celebrated, highest status people in the society. And Brahmins are really they're prohibited from doing like manual labor and things like that. Below that is the Kshatriyas, and initially they were the warrior caste, right? They were the ones who fought. But over time, Kshatriyas also took on jobs as running the government and governing society. So they're the kings and the generals and the bureaucrats, etc. So the idea of the military and the government is sort of a single caste that runs that. Then you have the Vaishyas, which is basically merchants and artisans and people who make and sell things. And then you have the Shudras, who are basically peasants. They're the farmers. They grow the food. Then there's a fifth group called the Untouchables, and they are not actually considered a caste. They're considered outcasts. They don't have a caste, and they are the bottom of society. Okay? And in this caste system, you marry within your caste, so Brahmins only marry Brahmins, and Kshatriyas only marry Kshatriyas, etc. And when we get to talking about the Bhagavad Gita, I want you to keep these castes in mind, because this is really crucial for understanding the Bhagavad Gita, which we're going to start reading fairly soon. Now, this mixture of Aryans and Dravidians produced a religion, right? Now, originally, when the Aryans arrived, they worshipped a god of war called Indra, And they had sort of a religion that was probably very similar to the other transactional religions we've talked about, where you have multiple gods and you pray to the gods to ask them for special favors and you offer them things for those special favors. But it's not considered there's a long-term relationship between the gods and human beings, and there's very little expectation that that the gods care what human beings are doing outside of these transactions. And so the initial religion that we see emerge in writing at this time, and they develop writing, is the Vedic religion. And this comes out of the Rig Veda, which is a text. It's a religious text. And the original Rig Veda is basically it's a guidebook for this transactional religion. It's mostly aimed at priests, and it's mostly telling them how to do certain ceremonies and things like that. It has very little to do with how people are supposed to live their lives, or what happens to us after we die, or what gods expect of us, or anything like that. It's mostly just here's a ceremony that you do for this, and here's how you do an offering for this, and here are the ceremonies you're supposed to do throughout the year, and sort of things like that. So it's really a guidebook, a handbook for priests in this transactional sort of religion. But between about 800 and 400 BCE, you see a new set of texts get written. These are called the Upanishads. And these new texts, these Upanishads, they're built on the Vedic religion. They have the same sort of basic ideas, but they go in a different direction. What they start to do is the Upanishads are asking questions about how we should act, and what is duty, and what is morality, and what's the order of the universe, and things like that. And so the Upanishads are shifting the religion away from what are priests supposed to do and what ceremonies they're supposed to do. Instead, they're shifting it towards this idea, what are individual people supposed to do? How do we practice this religion? How does the religion shape our everyday lives? How does it answer the big questions in life? So it becomes a religion much more focused on personal morality and much less focused on priests doing their proper role in the ceremonies and things. And so there's a couple key ideas that come out of the Upanishads, and these are really cool ideas, and they become foundational ideas in both Buddhism and Hinduism, which we'll get into later. And the Bhagavad Gita is a text in Hindu tradition. But they argue that basically every person has a soul and a body, and your soul is reborn into multiple bodies. After you die, you are reincarnated and you live another life, and then after that one dies, you live another life. And so you're constantly being reborn into new lives, and life is filled with suffering, right? And so the goal of the religion is to escape from that. And the idea is that you have to achieve moksha somehow. And moksha is release from the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Right? And so if you can achieve moksha, and each religion defines that differently, if you can achieve moksha, then your soul will not, when you die, your soul will go and join Brahman, who is the universal God, rather than returning to another body and being born again. And that's sort of, I don't want to oversimplify this, but it's sort of the Hindu and Buddhist version of heaven is to achieve moksha. Okay? But until you achieve moksha, you're just going to keep being reborn over and over and over again. Okay? So this religion, the Vedic religion giving away to the Upanishads, which would eventually lead to Hinduism and Buddhism and even Jainism, this represents a shift. And I mentioned it's 800 to 400 BCE. This represents a shift in what religion means. And I want to point out that this is about the same time period as what's happening with the creation of Judaism, right? The Babylonian captivity, where Judaism was really sort of transformed into a new religion, happened in the 500s BCE, which is right in the middle of the period the Upanishads are being written. And Judaism emerged as this religion that said that God has a personal relationship with people, and God has moral expectations of how people act. The Upanishads also moved the religion towards the idea that each individual person has to act in certain ways in order to conform to the religion. And so both of these religions are moving towards this idea that religion is not about just buying things from the gods through a bunch of transactions, but rather that the gods actually care how we act, and we have to act according to a certain moral code. and each person, each individual person, must act according to a certain moral code. That's a new idea in a religion. And we'll see how this develops into Hinduism, into Buddhism, and we'll compare this to other religions, because this really becomes a very interesting moment in human history when people sort of reconceptualize what religion means.